In February 1978, a historic white hurricane paralyzed the American Northeast and Midwest, trapping thousands in their cars and homes without heat, electricity, or communication. This is the story of how a nation survived 72 hours of isolation, using nothing but CB radios, community grit, and the will to endure. The winter of 1978 was already hard, but nobody predicted the meteorological bomb that exploded over the Ohio Valley and New England in early February. For 3 days, hurricane-force winds and relentless snow buried highways, shut down entire states, and severed the power grid. In an era before cell phones, GPS, or the internet, Americans were suddenly thrown back into the pioneer age. This documentary tracks the timeline of the storm, from the deceptive calm before the drop in pressure to the terrifying whiteout that buried drivers alive on Route 128 and I-75. It explores became lifelines, how radio DJs became heroes, and how the silence of the snow revealed the true character of the American community. Before the wind screams, before the high-tension power lines snap like dry twigs, and before the world turns a blinding, featureless white, there is a heavy, suffocating silence. It's the feeling of a barometer dropping through the floorboards, a physical weight in the air that makes the hair on your arms stand up. We think we know winter today. We have our heated seats, our remote starters, and our Doppler radar apps giving us minute-by-minute updates on our smartphones. If we slide off the road, help is just a text message away. We are tethered to safety by invisible digital threads, wrapped in a blanket of constant connectivity. But imagine, just for a moment, that those threads are cut. Rewind the tape to the first week of February 1978. There are no cell phones, no internet, no GPS satellites guiding you home. You are driving a rear-wheel drive station wagon down Interstate 95 in Massachusetts, or maybe the Ohio Turnpike. The heater is rattling, fighting a losing battle against the glass. The sky turns the color of a bruised plum, and then the snow doesn't just fall, it attacks. It comes in horizontal sheets, driven by hurricane-force winds that turn the highway into a wind tunnel. The visibility drops to zero, literally the end of your hood. Within an hour, the road is gone. Within 2, your car is a tomb. The engine dies. The heat fades. And outside, the drift is creeping up past the chrome door handle, then the window, then the roof. You are buried alive in a steel box, miles from home, and nobody, not your spouse, not the police, not the National Guard, knows where you are. For 72 hours, the most advanced nation on Earth was brought to its knees by frozen water. This wasn't just a snow day, it was a siege, a meteorological bomb that exploded over the Northeast and the Midwest, stopping time in its tracks. The lights went out, the furnaces died, and Americans were suddenly thrown back into the pioneer age, forced to reach deep into a reservoir of grit they didn't know they still had. This is the story of the Great Blizzard of '78, the week the modern world stopped, and nature reminded us exactly who is really in charge. It began as a conspiracy of air masses, thousands of miles apart, plotting a rendezvous that would rewrite the record books. To understand why this storm caught an entire region flat-footed, you have to understand the state of the art in 1978. We didn't have the Weather Channel yet. That was still 4 years away. There were no 24-hour scrolling tickers at the bottom of your screen. You got your forecast from the morning paper, delivered to your doorstep, or you waited for the 6 o'clock news, watching a guy in a polyester blazer slap magnetic suns and clouds onto a physical map. Meteorology was still as much art as it was science. The National Weather Service was running the numbers on massive mainframes, room-sized calculators that had less computing power than the digital watch you're wearing right now. They relied on weather balloons and grainy, black and white satellite photos that looked more like Rorschach tests than atmospheric data. And on Sunday, February 5th, those computers saw something standard, a nuisance. A typical winter low-pressure system moving through the Great Lakes, and another skirting up the coast. Separately, they were manageable. Just another gray week in the Rust Belt in New England. But the computers missed the timing. They missed the phasing. What was actually happening was a meteorological perfect storm. A blast of Arctic air, colder than deep space, was diving south from Canada. At the exact same moment, a warm, moisture-rich hurricane-force low was barreling up the Atlantic coast. The atmosphere was setting a trap. The forecasters predicted snow, sure, maybe a few inches, enough to grease the roads, but nothing to close the schools for. So, Monday morning dawned. The coffee percolators bubbled, the station wagons warmed up in the driveways, and millions of Americans did what they always did. They went to work. They sent their kids to school. They drove onto the highways, unaware that they were driving directly into the mouth of a monster. By the time the barometric pressure began to crash, dropping at a rate that qualifies as bombogenesis, or an explosive cyclogenesis, it was too late. The trap had already snapped shut. The two storms didn't just meet. They merged, stalled, and began to rotate like a giant white buzzsaw over the most densely populated corridor in the United States. The change wasn't gradual. It was violent. Around 1 p.m., the sky didn't just darken. It seemed to lower itself onto the rooftops. The wind shifted, picking up a howl that sounded less like weather and more like a freight train derailment. And then came the snow. Not the soft Christmas card variety, but hard pellets driven by 70-mile-per-hour gusts, stinging like sand. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. Inside the office towers of Boston, the factories of Ohio, and the schools of Providence, the same realization hit everyone simultaneously. We need to leave. Now. It triggered the most disastrous mass exodus in American history. Millions of people poured onto the highways at the exact same moment, but they were driving 1970s technology into a prehistoric force. Think about the cars of that era. These were rear-wheel drive behemoths, Detroit steel, heavy in the front, light in the back. On dry pavement, they were kings of the road. But on an inch of slick, wind-polished ice, they were sleds. As the accumulation rates hit 2, then 3 inches per hour, the interstates transformed into parking lots. Route 128 in Massachusetts, I-95 in Rhode Island, the Ohio Turnpike, they all seized up. A single jackknife tractor-trailer could paralyze 10 miles of road, and once you stopped, you were done. The snow didn't wait for the tow truck. It drifted against the tires, then the bumpers, then the hoods. Drivers sat behind the wheel, gripping the cold vinyl, listening to the wipers slap back and forth, fighting a losing battle against the accumulation. There were no cell phones to check traffic maps, no GPS to find a back road. If you were lucky, you had a CB radio. If not, you were isolated in a glass and steel box, watching the world disappear in a wall of white. The panic was quiet, but it was palpable. You could see it in the brake lights ahead of you, glowing like red embers in the swirling gray, going nowhere. The realization began to sink in. The heater is running, the gas gauge is dropping, and we aren't moving. There is a specific kind of silence that happens when a V8 engine finally gives up the ghost. It's heavy. It's final. As night fell on the blizzard of '78, that silence rippled down the eastern seaboard, car by car, mile by mile. People ran their engines as long as they dared, cycling the heat on and off to conserve fuel. But eventually, the gas gauges hit empty. When the engines died, the real storm moved inside. You have to remember what night looked like back then. We didn't have LED billboards or omnipresent smartphone glow. When the power grid failed, and it failed spectacularly, taking out entire states, the darkness was absolute. The only light came from the storm itself. The snow was falling so thick and fast, it seemed to catch the ambient gray of the universe, glowing with a ghostly, pale luminescence. Inside those stranded cars, the station wagons, the sedans, the delivery trucks, the temperature plummeted. A 1970s car wasn't insulated like a modern vehicle. It was a steel box with vinyl seats that turned rock hard in the cold. Frost began to form on the inside of the windshields. But here is where the story shifts. In the face of this terrifying isolation, a strange, almost beautiful ecosystem emerged. Without Twitter or 24-hour news cycles to feed the panic, people did something old-fashioned. They looked at the person next to them. Strangers stranded in a drift on Route 128 suddenly became roommates. You saw drivers climbing out of their windows because the doors were blocked by drifts, wading through waist-deep powder to check on the elderly couple in the Buick behind them. They shared what they had: a thermos of coffee, a pack of cigarettes, a candy bar found in a glove compartment. The lifeline of the night was the Citizens Band radio. If you had a CB, you were the news anchor. The airwaves were crackling with voices in the dark. Truckers, the knights of the road, were coordinating checks, telling people to keep their tailpipes clear so carbon monoxide wouldn't kill them in their sleep. For hours, the snow just kept stacking. 1 foot, 2 feet, drifts reaching 10, 15 feet high. It buried the cars completely. From the air, the highway looked like a bumpy white quilt. But underneath those bumps were thousands of beating hearts, huddled in coats, in blankets, waiting for a dawn that felt like it might never come. To understand why this storm brought the Northeast to its knees, you can't just look at the meteorology. You have to look at the architecture of the American dream in 1978. For 30 years following the Second World War, we had been busy rearranging the geography of our lives. We built the interstate highway system, the greatest engineering project in human history, and with it, we invented modern suburbia. We separated where we slept from where we worked, stitching the two together with ribbons of asphalt. By the late 70s, the automobile wasn't just a luxury, it was the prosthetic limb of the American worker. We had designed a society that required a 2-ton steel machine just to buy a quart of milk or punch a time clock. But there was a crack in the foundation. 1978 was a time of deep national anxiety. We were already bruised by Vietnam and Watergate. We were reeling from the energy crises. We stood in lines for gasoline. We watched inflation eat our paychecks. There was a growing, nagging suspicion that the systems we built were too big, too complex, and too fragile to last. The blizzard of '78 proved that suspicion right in a matter of hours. This wasn't just a weather event, it was an infrastructure collapse. We had built a civilization that relied entirely on motion, constant, burning motion. When the highways clogged and the power lines snapped under the weight of the ice, the illusion of control evaporated. The suburbs, designed as refuges of comfort, suddenly became archipelagos of isolation. Without electricity, the oil furnaces wouldn't fire. Without the plows, the cul-de-sacs were prisons. The grocery stores, which operated on just-in-time delivery long before we had a name for it, went bare in an afternoon. We found out the hard way that our independence was dependent on a grid that could be taken out by frozen water. The storm caught us in a moment of hubris. We thought we had conquered winter with salt trucks and radial tires. But nature simply leaned against the door we built, and the whole house shook. As Tuesday evening bled into Wednesday morning, the psychology of the storm began to shift. During the daylight, there was still a sense of novelty, a shared, strange adventure. But when the gray light faded and the true darkness of a power outage night set in, the mood inside those colonial houses and ranch-style ramblers changed. The first warning sign wasn't a siren, it was silence. If you've never experienced a total blackout during a blizzard, you can't truly understand the quiet. It's heavy. It presses against your eardrums. The hum of the refrigerator, the whir of the furnace, the ambient buzz of the streetlights, all the white noise of the 20th century simply vanished. And then, the cold began to creep in. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, invasive species. First, the floors got chilly. Then you started seeing your breath in the living room. The thermostat on the wall, usually a trusted dial of comfort, became a useless piece of plastic. The needle resting dead at 50 degrees, then 45, then 40. This is where the transformation happened. This is where the snow day ended and the survival situation began. Families consolidated. You closed off the bedrooms, hung blankets over doorways to trap body heat, and retreated to the kitchen or the den. We became cave dwellers in our own modern homes. The fireplace, often just an aesthetic focal point for holiday cards, suddenly became the most important technology in the house. If you had wood, you were royalty. If you didn't, you were breaking up furniture. Our only lifeline to the outside world was the transistor radio. In 1978, there was no Twitter feed to scroll, no text messages to check on grandma. There was only the crackle of AM radio. We huddled around those battery-operated boxes like they were campfires. We listened to local DJs, guys who usually played top 40 hits or called baseball games, transform into lifeline dispatchers. They were reading messages from the National Guard, pleading with people to stay off the roads, and relaying the terrifying reality that emergency vehicles were stuck just like the rest of us. That voice in the dark was the only proof that the rest of the world still existed. But as the batteries faded and the wind howled like a freight train outside the frosted glass, a collective realization settled over the Northeast. The infrastructure hadn't just paused. It had been defeated. Wednesday morning, dawn broke, but the sun didn't. If Tuesday was the adventure, and Tuesday night was the warning, Wednesday was the reckoning. You woke up, stiff, cold, seeing your breath in the bedroom air, and you went to the window expecting to see the black asphalt of the street, expecting to see the plow trucks flashing their yellow strobes. Instead, you saw a wall of white, not a drift, but a monolith. In some towns, the snow was drifting up to the second-story eaves. You couldn't open the front door even if you wanted to. This was the moment the American illusion of control shattered. We are a culture built on mobility. The automobile is our birthright. The open road is our freedom. But out on the interstates, Route 128 in Massachusetts, I-95 in Rhode Island, that freedom had turned into a trap. Thousands of motorists were still out there. They had been sitting in their station wagons and sedans for 12, 18, 24 hours. The snow had buried them completely. From the air, the highway didn't look like a road. It looked like a lumpy white quilt. Underneath those mounds were people. And this is where the tragedy struck. It wasn't just the hypothermia, it was the exhaust. People did the logical thing. They kept the engine running to keep the heater blowing. But as the snow piled up against the rear bumpers, it clogged the tailpipes. The carbon monoxide had nowhere to go but back inside the cabin. It was a silent, odorless killer. Entire families simply fell asleep and never woke up. Back in the neighborhoods, the romanticism of the blizzard had evaporated. The pantry was getting thin. That panic-bought milk and bread? Gone. The novelty of melting snow on the wood stove for toilet water had worn off. The psychological toll was mounting. Cabin fever is a real medical condition when the walls are literally closing in. We started to realize that the systems we paid taxes for, the police, the fire department, the ambulance services, were paralyzed. The plows were broken down or stuck in drifts the size of houses. The National Guard was mobilizing, but even their heavy transport trucks were jackknifing. We were witnessing the total collapse of the supply chain. No food trucks were moving, no oil tankers were delivering heating fuel. The grid wasn't just down, the physical arteries of the Northeast were severed. By Wednesday afternoon, the realization hit every frozen living room from New Haven to Portland. The cavalry wasn't coming. Not today, maybe not tomorrow. We had reached the bottom of the barrel, and the snow was still falling. When the systems broke, the people woke up. It started not with a siren, but with the sound of metal scraping on pavement. One shovel, then two, then 10. By Wednesday evening, a strange thing happened across the frozen Northeast. The fear that had gripped us in the dark began to transmute into something else. Something older, something uniquely American. Call it grit, call it stubbornness, or just plain Yankee ingenuity. We realized that if the plow trucks couldn't get through, we had to become the plow trucks. This was the golden hour of the snowmobile. Before this storm, they were just recreational toys for the weekend warriors. Suddenly, they were the only ambulances left on Earth. You saw teenage kids and grandfathers alike ripping down the center of silent, buried interstates, delivering insulin to diabetics and formula to trapped mothers. The local snowmobile clubs didn't wait for orders. They organized search and rescue grids over the CB radio. And speaking of radios, this was the moment the Citizens Band saved us. Long before the internet or cell phones, the airwaves crackled with life. Breaker 19, we got a family stranded on Route 1. Truckers, trapped in their rigs, became command centers, relaying messages between police and volunteers. The static was the sound of a community hot-wiring its own survival. Inside the homes, the walls stopped closing in and started opening up. The great thaw dinner parties began. With freezers dying, that expensive steak and the Thanksgiving turkey you'd been saving had to be cooked now. Neighbors who had merely nodded at each other for 10 years were suddenly sharing a candlelight feast of filet mignon and canned beans, huddled around a kerosene heater. We improvised. We turned sleds into supply convoys. Doctors and nurses strapped on cross-country skis, trekking 10 miles through whiteout conditions just to relieve a shift at the hospital. We tunneled out of second-story windows like gophers, carving trenches to the street. There was no looting. There was no anarchy. When the veneer of civilization was stripped away by 40 inches of snow, we didn't turn on each other. We turned toward each other. You'd see a stranger walking down the middle of a buried street, and you didn't ask who they were, you asked what they needed. For those 72 hours, social status evaporated. The banker was stuck in the same drift as the mechanic, and out there in the cold, the only currency that mattered was a strong back and a dry pair of wool socks. We were cold, yes, but we had never been warmer toward one another. The snow eventually melted. It turned to slush, then to gray water, and finally drained into the sewers. But the storm didn't leave. It moved out of our driveways and into our mythology. Almost overnight, surviving those 72 hours became a badge of honor. It was the civilian equivalent of a war medal. You saw it on the chests of teenagers and grandmothers alike, the iron-on letters pressed onto Hanes cotton t-shirts. I survived the blizzard. It became the ultimate "where were you" moment. If you lived through it, you had a story. The time you walked 3 miles for milk. The time you dug your car out with a frying pan. The time the National Guard landed a helicopter on the high school football field. The storm changed the way we watch television too. Before this, the weather report was a 2-minute segment at the end of the news. After the whiteout, the weatherman became a celebrity, a trusted general in the field. This was the birth of the storm team, the 24-hour coverage, the reporter standing sideways in a gale-force wind just to prove it was windy. We realized that weather wasn't just small talk. It was a narrative, a thriller unfolding in real time. And then there were the blizzard babies. It's a statistical fact and a national punchline. When the lights went out and the heat failed, couples huddled together for warmth. Nature took its course. 9 months later, maternity wards from Buffalo to Boston saw a spike in deliveries that defied the actuarial tables. A whole micro-generation born of boredom, cold, and candlelight. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was the way it rewired our relationship with winter. Before the storm, snow was courier and Ives, sleigh bells and silent nights. After the dig-out, snow was a formidable adversary. We lost a bit of our innocence that week. We learned that the infrastructure we trusted, the power grid, the highway system, the supply chain, was fragile. Yet decades later, we don't look back on it with horror. We look back with a strange, complicated affection. We romanticize the big one. We tell our grandkids about the snowdrifts that reach the telephone wires, not to scare them, but to remind them of a time when the world forced us to stop. When the school closings lasted for 2 weeks, and the only thing on the schedule was survival. It became the yardstick by which all future storms would be measured. Every time a flake falls now, someone, somewhere, leans back and says, "Sure, it's snowing, but it's not the blizzard." Walk into a grocery store today when the forecast calls for 6 inches, and you'll see the same panic in the bread aisle that you saw 40 years ago. That survival instinct hasn't faded, but the toolkit has changed entirely. We don't just stock up on milk and eggs anymore. We charge the portable power banks. We download seasons of TV shows to iPads. We make sure the generator has gas. The element of surprise, however, is dead. In the era of the big one, the storm ambushed us. Today, we track it. We have supercomputers in our pockets that show us the barometric pressure in real time. We watch the Doppler radar swirl on our screens like a mesmerizing digital lava lamp. We know the flake count before the first cloud even crosses the county line. But this foresight has come at a cost. We've lost the sanctity of the snow day. Remember that feeling? Waking up, listening to the radio, waiting for your school district to be called out in alphabetical order? It was a reprieve from the universe, a free pass. Today, with high-speed internet and Zoom, the world doesn't stop for weather. If the roads are closed, the office is just moved to the kitchen table. The kids aren't building forts, they're logging into virtual classrooms. We've engineered the pause button right out of existence. And our vulnerability has shifted too. Back then, losing power meant lighting a kerosene lamp and putting an extra quilt on the bed. It was physical. Today, our lives are tethered to the grid in a way that's almost terrifying. Our heat is often electric. Our communication is digital. Even our cars are starting to need a wall outlet. When the juice gets cut now, we don't just get cold, we get isolated. We go blind. The silence of a modern home without Wi-Fi is louder than the wind outside. We have better plows now. We have heated seats in all-wheel drive SUVs that act like tanks. We salt the roads with a brine solution that prevents ice before it forms. Technologically, we are masters of our domain. But look at the modern response to a major freeze. We see grid failures in Texas. We see supply chains snap in the Northeast. We've built a society that runs on a tightrope of efficiency, just-in-time delivery, and constant connectivity. The snow doesn't care about our efficiency. It doesn't care about the quarterly earnings call or the Zoom meeting. And when a storm like the one from our past hits a world this dependent on the delicate flow of electrons, the stakes aren't just about getting stuck in a drift. They're about the total cessation of modern life. We are better prepared to see it coming, sure. But are we better prepared to endure it? There is a profound humility in a whiteout. In a country defined by movement, by the interstate highway system, the assembly line, and the relentless pursuit of the next big thing, the blizzard is the only force powerful enough to command a total stop. It is the red light that refuses to turn green. When you look back at those 72 hours of isolation, you realize the storm didn't just bury our cars, it buried our hubris. We spend our lives building structures to keep the elements at bay. We insulate, we pave, we regulate. But when the mercury drops and the wind howls at 50 miles an hour, that veneer of control vanishes. The blizzard strips us down to our factory settings. It is the great equalizer. The snow falls on the CEO's driveway just as heavy as it falls on the shift worker's sidewalk. It doesn't care about your zip code or your credit score. When the power lines snap, the mansion gets just as dark and just as cold as the trailer. In that freezing darkness, we are forced to confront a truth we usually pay good money to ignore. We are small, biological things living on a planet that is indifferent to our comfort. Yet inside that vulnerability, there's a strange grace. The silence of a snow-covered world is heavy, almost spiritual. It muffles the noise of politics and commerce. It forces families into the same room, huddled around a single fireplace or a camp stove. It shrinks the world down to the four walls of your home and the safety of your immediate neighbors. That's the paradox of the deep freeze. It isolates us physically, but it binds us socially. When the plows can't get through, we don't call the government. We call the guy next door who has a shovel. We check on the elderly lady across the street. We share firewood. We trade batteries for baby formula. The blizzard tears down the modern infrastructure, but it rebuilds the ancient infrastructure of the tribe. It reminds us that when the grid fails and the screens go black, all we really have is each other. There is a specific quality to the light the morning after a historic blizzard. It is blindingly, impossibly bright. The cloud cover breaks, the barometric pressure rises, and the sun reflects off a billion ice crystals, turning the landscape into a sea of diamonds. It's a beauty that hurts your eyes, a stark, brilliant apology from nature for the violence of the days before. Then comes the sound. Not the wind, but the scrape, the rhythmic, metal-on-concrete rasp of a flat-edged shovel hitting the sidewalk, the roar of a snowblower eating through a drift, the distant rumble of the county plow finally breaking the blockade at the end of the road. These are the sounds of civilization clawing its way back to the surface. Slowly, the power grids flicker back to life. The furnace kicks on with a reassuring hum. The refrigerator starts buzzing. We charge our phones. We turn on the television, and just like that, the spell is broken. The primitive tribe dissolves, and we become modern individuals again, worrying about emails and schedules in the state of the driveway. The pristine white snow turns to gray slush in the gutters, and the magic fades into the mundane reality of a Tuesday morning commute. But the memory doesn't melt. It hardens. It becomes part of the local bedrock. Decades later, you'll hear old-timers in diners and hardware stores measuring every new winter against the big one. It becomes a benchmark of survival, a badge of honor pinned to the chest of the community. We were there, we say. We made it through the dark. In the end, the blizzard teaches us that we are tougher than we look, but more fragile than we admit. It reminds us that for all our technology, all our asphalt, and all our ambition, we are still tenants on this land, living at the mercy of the sky. And when the next whiteout comes, and it will come, we'll be ready to slow down, huddle close, and endure. Because that is what we do. We dig out, we look up, and we keep going.